The final person you're going to hear from is Robin Brown, who is with DFO and is one of their science guys and is going to talk about the federal information products.
Thanks a lot. So, an important bit of clarification. I am not a scientist. I'm a science manager, and I have people who work for me who are scientists who would be anxious if they were in this room to explain that difference to you. So, this talk has a fairly heavy DFO perspective, or bias, depending on your point of view. But I got to point out that many of the activities and documents I'm going to talk about have had substantial input and leadership from a variety of federal departments and agencies, the ones that carry out science activities in this area. And you really have to delve into the authorship and affiliations to see this. And in particular, I would note contributions from Natural Resources Canada, Environment Canada, and Parks Canada. Now, scientists are by and large a promiscuous lot. They seek out the colleagues they need to do their work, often with little respect, and by which I mean disdain, for organizational boundaries, restrictions, rules, policies, and procedures. And in this case, we need to be grateful to them for this. So I prepared this sheet that lists a selection of the scientific and technical documents for PNCIMA. It's out on the back table. If you have insomnia, here's the place. Okay, overview of the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about science, business as usual in these departments and agencies. These organizations, like mine, have large and broad mandates. They do carry out science for a variety of purposes, many of which are not explicitly tied to PNCIMA, but they might be important and relevant. So you don't want to lose track of those parts of the components. And these are pretty strong on scientific publications in the primary literature, some very highly specific and highly technical scientific analyses, assessment of specific stocks, but they're useful in this context. I want to talk a bit about PNCIMA before it was actually named, before it was identified. And there was a brief period of intense science activity before the Oceans Action Plan, before PNCIMA had boundaries and a cool name. And that produced a bunch of summary reports, mostly associated with the Central Coast LRMP process and issues about the apparent emergence of activity for offshore oil and gas. So those are included on this list here. But mainly what I want to focus on is the Oceans Action Plan era, where there was some dedicated work to assemble scientific information on the PNCIMA area. And so this provided some new funding for data review, compilation, and integration. It was not new funding for giant programs of observations and new and exciting science. It was really, what do we know from the published and existing information that we can bring to the table to help inform a planning process? There was a standardized approach for large ocean managements across Canada, and any of you who work in a national organization will know how much of a joke this is when you try and impose national standards on a country which isn't very consistent. So I'm going to focus most of my energy in there, and then I'd like to talk about, after the Oceans Action Plan, some things that are going on now that are quite relevant to the marine planning thing we're talking about for PNCIMA. Okay. So, under the Oceans Action Plan, a standardized approach was developed to move towards integrated planning in large ocean management areas, and we had a recipe, the Jake Rice recipe. You take ecosystem overview and assessment reports, you add ecologically and biologically sensitive areas, to that mix you add ecologically sensitive species community properties, a dash of depleted species and degraded areas, and you mix these and let them settle to produce conservation objectives. These are kind of biological in nature. When you have conservation objectives, you then add into the mix marine use analysis and other kinds of socioeconomic and cultural analyses to result in ecosystem objectives where the ecosystem includes the people who live in that ecosystem and are making use of it. So in the Oceans Action Plan years, most of the effort was used to develop this recipe and bake this cake. So the largest effort was the ecosystem overview. And those of you who are here lucky those of you who are here early may have been lucky enough to pick up a very thick report that was sitting on the table out there. So some of you people will be quite weighed down on your trip home by this report. It's a long, long document, 600 pages. We knew we were in trouble when we got a 100-page guidance document on how to write a report that was supposed to be 100 pages. But in the grand tradition of people who work a long way from Ottawa, we ignored the parts of the instructions we didn't like and rearranged the rest of it. And so what you see there in this outline, the summary information will move to the front. There's about 100 pages of stuff we hope that people might read. There's some very detailed appendices that describe what that summary information is based on, and we think those will be useful for a lot of other purposes. And in fact, they've already turned out to be useful. Again, review of what's known, not a bunch of new research. Lots of maps. And this document and most of the other ones shown on this thing are available in the DFO virtual library and searchable through the DFO online library catalog. And DFO has many deficiencies, but we have a really good national library system for science and technical documents, supported by a team of really good science librarians who impart structure and rigor on unruly scientists and their publications. So the next phase of this was the ecologically and biologically sensitive areas, and it relates a lot to stuff that Russ and Neil were talking about. This is place-based information, geospatial, drawing maps, what's going on in various areas, and this is not a traditional, was not a traditional area of work for DFO, which was most historically concerned with statistical areas and other place-based but not ecologically relevant systems. So we generate a large number of map areas, and we use these in some fairly simple analyses to identify ecological hotspots and ecological special spots. A weakness of this, because of the size of the area, because of the complexity, nearshore areas, bays, estuaries, and fjords were essentially set aside for further work, further analysis at higher spatial resolutions. Some of this has been developed at better in the Haida Gwaii process by Parks Canada. Development of these ecologically and biologically sensitive areas is a relatively young process in Canada and internationally, and there's probably more work required, but you can't listen to any talk by a scientist that doesn't have more work will be required. So then there was another axis to this analysis. We have place-based stuff, but not everything is about place. There are some other important things to capture. Which species were particularly important regardless of where they were, and properties of communities that need special consideration. And this analysis was much more challenging than the EBS analysis. Is not an area where DFO has great strength. Our historical data holdings focused on a relatively modest number of commercial species. So this is something we'll have to come back to in more detail later.